Good morning. It's October 17th, 2021. I am Pastor Dani Veenstra, the minister at St. Paul's United Church of Christ in Watervliet. And we have been putting our scripture and sermons online for those folks who are unable to make it to church, still have compromised health issues. And this way, they too are able to hear the message that is preached this morning at St. Paul's. The sermon today is called by God. The scripture references are Genesis 14, verses 17 through 19, and Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. Beginning with the Genesis. After Abram returned from his attack on Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom came out of the Shaveh Valley to meet him. Now Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and the priest of Elyon had brought bread and wine, and he blessed Abram. Bless Abram by Elyon, creator of heaven and earth. Bless Elyon, who gave you the victory over your enemies. And then from Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. Every high priest is taken from the people and put in charge of things that relate to God for their sake, in order to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. The high priest is able to deal gently with the ignorant and those who are misled, since he or she is also prone to weakness. Because of the weakness, the priest must offer sacrifices for their own sins as well as those of the people. No one takes this honor for themselves, but takes it only when they are called by God, like Aaron. In the same way, Christ also didn't promote himself to become high priest. Instead, it was God who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father, your mother." Also he said in another place, God said in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." During his days on earth, Christ offered prayers and requests with loud cries and tears as his sacrifices to the one who was able to save him from death. He was heard because of his godly devotion. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. After he'd been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for everyone who obeys him. He was appointed by God to be a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So called by God. The main point of my message this morning is two-pronged. You are called by God, and you are called to be perfect. Do you run from the idea that you are called by God? Does the thought of maybe how difficult your life might be as part of being God's priest, worker, messenger scare you? I guess maybe it should, though, because to answer God's call to follow Jesus and live as Jesus did with compassion and passion for God's dream of mercy and justice is not an easy life. But we can, as church and as individuals, take heart, for we're told no one takes this honor for themselves, but takes it only when they are called by God. Are you called? Yep, you betcha. There are a lot of verses in our scriptures, in both the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament, that tell us we're all called to serve. I like this one that Paul wrote to the church at Corinth. Only let each person lead the life the Lord has assigned to them and to which God has called them. God has assigned a life path for you to live out. God has called you to walk that path. Plain and simple. Each one of us. Because God calls us, though, God will give us the tools, the skills, the opportunities to serve. And just as the high priest in our Genesis and our passages today, that high priest had faults. We have faults. God knows we're prone to weakness. But this should encourage us to be gracious to others when they fall and fall short, only to have God help us and them get back up again and continue to serve. You know, answering God's call may be something as simple as serving on a committee at the church, or picking up the phone and calling folks you know are lonely or having trouble getting out. Your call may be to volunteer somewhere. At the Out Center, that drop-in place for LGBT youth to come and feel safe and loved. The food pantry where we are providing necessities for families in our area. Always can use volunteers. Be a literacy teacher for children or adults. Shovel or plow your neighbor's driveway. Cook a meal for someone, ill or not. Bring it over and say, I just thought of you, here. Your call may not be huge, like Sine Gugu, our pianist who has been called to serve in Thailand. It may not mean sacrificing your comfy way of life. It may be just being the very best Jesus follower you can be, exactly where you are. Answering God's call may simply be to sit in the dark with someone and point the way out of the darkness because you've been there before. We're told that even Jesus didn't step forward on his own. We heard today in the same way Christ didn't promote himself to become a high priest. It was God who said, you are my son, you are a priest, according to the order of Melchizedek. God claimed Jesus first as beloved child before God called Jesus to serve. Wrapped in family love, Jesus was able to do the task he'd been called to do, knowing he was not alone. The same is true for each one of you. God calls us first as beloved children, wraps us in the very best kind of family love, and we are never alone doing God's work. Now, the part about the priest according to the order of Melchizedek refers back to the Hebrew scripture that I read a few verses of, where after a big battle that Abram and his fellow warriors had won, the priest came out and blessed them and blessed God. Melchizedek was serving as a priest, blending his faith and real life, messy as it was. Because in those days, defending your faith and your way of life might mean you went into battle where people were killed and goods were stolen. We may not be able to see that as godly. We don't understand that tribal way of life. But for Abram and Melchizedek, it was the way of defending their faith, a matter of life and death. Doesn't look very godly. Where might God be calling you? That doesn't look very sacred. For we are each called, and we might struggle to discern what is the task that God is calling me to. So I invite you to ask your family and your friends, the people who know you the best, where do you see me serving the Lord? Ask your minister. I see gifts in each one of you. Ask God and then shut up and wait for God to give you the answer. Near the end of today's reading, we got this line about Jesus that might make serving God seem even harder, more than we're capable of. It said after he had been made perfect, he became the source of salvation. We're all called to be like Jesus. But I want you to know we're not called to be perfect in the sense that we have of what that word means. For us, I think being perfect means never making a mistake, being saintly, never cussing out that driver who cuts you off in traffic, never grumbling about that pile of dog poo in your yard when you don't own a dog. Perfect is always kind, always giving, always perfect. Jesus was made perfect. In the gospel called Matthew, Jesus tells us, be perfect as I am perfect, as your God is perfect. Be perfect? Me? Without flaws? I'm far from perfect. But wait a minute. From biblesociety.org.uk, we hear this. Most of us listen to this be perfect command with dismay because we think we don't have to just be normally perfect. We have to be perfect as God is perfect. We might as well just give up right now. But Jesus is talking here about the law with a capital L, whichever way that's got to be on your screen. And he's trying to teach us that following God's laws doesn't mean getting all the rules just so, but living into the intent of the law. This isn't an intellectual exercise. It requires whole life answering God's call, transformation. We are called to mirror the character of God, not merely to do or say the right thing. So now that word perfect, that's what trips us up in this passage, but it's probably a mistranslation of the original Greek. When the Vulgate, the 4th century Bible that was translated into Latin, the common vulgar language of the day, the word was translated as perfectus, but the Greek is teleios. And that can mean perfect, but most usually it's meant as maturity or wholeness. So it's really what Jesus was saying is be mature, be whole, as God is mature and whole. God doesn't say one thing and do another. God doesn't pretend to be compassionate and not really care. God is sincere and whole and wholehearted, and we should be too. Mature, complete. This I can strive for. I can strive to be mature and complete in my following of Jesus. And on the flip side, as imperfect creatures, there's value in our imperfections. Paul wrote to the church at Corinth and said, we have this treasure in clay jars, not perfect things. So it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and doesn't come from us. We are clay jars holding this tremendous power of God's love. But sometimes clay jars can be beautiful, glazed perfectly, and other times they crack in the kiln. And the people in Corinth were known for their pottery. Not just that beautiful, highly glazed vases, but the ones that cracked and then were used to put a light in, and the light diffused out of the cracks. Those cracks are vital, because a well-glazed pot keeps the light in, but one with cracks lets the light out. You're called by God to be like that cracked clay pot, a vessel shining God's light into the world. So know that God will equip you for the task, whatever it is, calling you first as beloved child, to mirror the mature nature of God, not merely to do and say the right things. You're called to be mature and complete as Jesus is mature and complete, reflecting God's nature as you answer God's call on your life in the order of Melchizedek, the high priest who served in ways that blessed those around him and blessed God. So as you strive to answer God's call on your life, may you bless those around you. May your imperfections allow God's light to shine brightly, so filled with God's power that people will see it and be drawn to it like a moth to a flame. May you answer God's call with your life. May you shine, and may you make it so every day.